So Dune Awakening is an upcoming survival MMO with a much larger emphasis on the survival aspects, but some of the social MMO aspects are some of the most interesting and most important parts of the game, especially the player market and the ability for players to trade a majority of the items in the game. And that's the main thing I want to go over in this video. Also, make sure to subscribe. I'm going to be doing a ton of Dune Awakening videos leading up to the release, and then I'm going to be doing a ridiculous amount of videos once the game is actually released. Now, one of my favorite parts of many MMOs is the ability to freely trade a majority of the items in the game, usually also consists of an auction house or a market, and these are also going to be present within Dune Awakening. So you can go to any of the hubs of the game and you'll be able to visit the bazaar, or what's basically a player market or auction house, where you'll be able to buy or sell pretty much any items in the game to other players, so they can go there as well and just buy or sell those items from you. And this is generally going to play a major role within the entirety of Dune Awakening, especially if you're a more PvE driven player, because a lot of the best resources are going to be within the deep desert, meaning that's full open PvP. But if you're a PvE player, you can just focus on farming or doing other things in Haga Basin and sell those to other players, earn yourself enough currency to buy the much more valuable or rare things that other PvP players are finding in the deep desert. So even if you're like a solo focused PvE player, you still should be able to obtain pretty much everything within the game just buying it from other players. And likewise, something else that's very important is the main currency you're going to be using to buy or to get from selling something, and that's going to be spice. It seems that spice is going to play multiple different roles. First off, it seems to be the literal main currency of the game. In some of the gameplay reveals we've gotten, especially one where they go and talk to a vendor that you can buy weapons from, you can see that their main currency has an S symbol next to it. So it seems that spice is literally just used as the main currency as well, but spice also seems to be used for some other things. More specifically, your character can ingest spice and in some way augment or buff up their abilities. There also seems to be another part of progression where you have to consume or be in contact with enough spice, and this will allow you to in some way augment your abilities, because it takes you to this kind of hallucination realm that also seems to have some other form of progression in it as well. And spice being a main currency is also going to play a pretty big role, not just because it's a main currency, but also because you're able to go and harvest large amounts of spice within the deep desert. That's also why it's going to be one of the most lucrative areas to go in the game, because you and your whole guild could fly in a bunch of spice harvesters and harvest massive amounts of spice that, say, a more PvE focused player wouldn't be able to do. But as mentioned, that absolutely does not mean PvE players aren't going to be able to make a bunch of spice from selling things to other players as well, because there's multiple other systems that are going to play pretty massive roles in the whole of the game. One of those being the building and blueprinting system. So if you don't know how building in Dune Awakening works, it's going to work in a similar way to a lot of other survival games, where you can just place down buildings, you can place down walls, floors, ceilings. They even have rounded building options, so you don't have to make a bunch of triangles to try to make a kind of more round building. And then you have full customization within your bases, so a bunch of different crafting and fabrication stations you can make. And then there's also just cosmetic options. You can put down like tables, chairs, you can put things on top of that to be able to fully customize your bases, their looks, and their utility. But once you've actually built a base, you can blueprint the entirety of your base. We don't know if there's any specific limits upon that, like maybe there's some absurdly high limit to how many different things can be in a singular blueprint. But what this allows you to do is blueprint a full base, and you can use that blueprint to replace down a full base as holograms, which is one of the building options in the game. And when you place down those holograms, you can then build into those holograms. So basically what this allows you to do is have this blueprint and be able to place down full bases pretty easily, and then you just put the resources into them to make them actual physical bases. But this ties back into the economy of the game pretty heavily, because these blueprints can be traded to other players and can be sold on the player market. So you could be somebody that is only PvE focused, so never goes to the deep desert, and you could be somebody that's really good at making really defensible bases. Maybe you have different turrets set up here. Maybe it's super hard to actually raid or attack this base. It's super defensible. Maybe you make a really good crafting base layout. So you have rows and rows of like fabrication stations set up really nicely. You can then blueprint those, take those to the market, sell them to another player, make yourself a ton of spice, and that player can take that and go place those bases everywhere. And these are actually going to be really important because the deep desert is wiped on a weekly basis. So all these big guilds are going to be going to the deep desert, placing down all of these bases, and they're going to want to get them down pretty early on, especially if they find really lucrative areas. They're going to want to get down these bases really quickly that are then wiped away the next week. So they can buy the PvE player's sold blueprint that's a really good defensible base. They can go place it down in the deep desert, fully make up that base out of the holograms, and then they're good to go for that week. They have this really nice base. But then they may want to buy other blueprints to do other things, and we really don't know if these blueprints are going to have a certain amount of times you can use them. Presumably blueprints will have some amount of charges. So maybe you buy a blueprint from another player and maybe you can only use it 10 times and then you have to buy other blueprints. That would probably be the best for the overall economy. If you're a player that's really good at building things and that's what you want to focus on, you will be able to actually kind of corner a market with that. And then in a similar fashion, you're going to have your crafting schematics or recipes. Basically, doing anything out in the world, you can come across different recipes that allow you to craft different things. And we know there's going to be different versions of a lot of the, say, weapons or gear or even vehicle crafts. So maybe you're out in some specific dungeon and you kill the boss and he drops a recipe for a really nice higher tier of this specific weapon that's maybe really popular. We know the recipes specifically are going to have a certain amount of crafts on them. So you could go craft up all the uses on that recipe and sell off all of those weapons to make yourself a bunch of spice as well. And that even gets more interesting when you factor into the deep desert changing on a weekly basis. Let's say there's an opened up dungeon this week in the deep desert and the boss has a chance to drop this really rare weapon recipe. Let's say you go farm that a handful of times and you're like the only one that's done that dungeon this week, or you're the only one that has that recipe left over into the next week. Well, at the end of that week, the Coriolis storm comes through, wipes away the desert, changes up a bunch of stuff. It may fill in that dungeon you were just running. Now it's not accessible for that week, and it could potentially not even be accessible for like a month after that. So now you, with your handful of different recipes that have a certain amount of charges on them, you could be the only one in your overarching world that's able to craft that weapon. Let's say that weapon's super valuable for late game PvP. Well, now pretty much everybody on that world's going to want to buy those weapons. So you can completely corner that market until that dungeon exists again within the deep desert, which can be somewhat random. So that dungeon couldn't open up again for weeks or potentially even months. And because of how they're doing this recipe system, where certain areas will drop specific recipes, you could be doing this type of thing consistently over time and over your playtime in the game to try to corner the market for these much more rare crafting recipes. And then you also just have the kind of base element of all of this, of just crafting like base weapons, base gear, base vehicles, all of those type of more basic crafts you probably don't need to have special recipes for. Just crafting all of that in larger amounts and selling it off to PvP players that are going in the deep desert will probably be lucrative as well. Because if you think about it, if you have, say, this big PvP guild that is focused every week on going into the deep desert, trying to harvest spice and get more rare stuff, they may be starting to run out of your base vehicles or basic weapon or ammo replenishments. Things like that can run out pretty quickly in PvP. You could be a PvE focused player in Haga Basin, just farming up resources and crafting these items and then selling them to other players, and you could just move a ton of all of these different items just being someone that's focused on crafting those base elements. And I think this element of Dune Awakening, the massive player market, is actually going to be very interesting and unique compared to the majority of other survival games. Almost no other survival games have an auction house or market system like this. If you want to go trade things in, say, Ark Survival Evolved, you basically just had to fly to another person and drop something on the ground for them, which could also backfire on either one of you because you could just attack and kill that other person and take the thing they were going to give you anyway. anyway, so you never really end up getting this overarching player economy in games like that. The only other survival game I could think of that has an actual auction house system is Myth of Empires, and that was actually really fun to use when that game first came out because people were just selling harder to get items at ludicrous prices. We just ran around and gathered a bunch of clay and sold it for a ton of currency. And that'll be a pretty similar thing in Dune Awakening, just it'll be expanded upon and have much more depth than a lot of other games have. So this is definitely one of the elements of Dune Awakening that I am most excited for. That overarching player economy adds just so much possible gameplay, and when it's supported correctly, like being able to sell these blueprints, like having these rare recipes that can only be used a certain amount of times, the player economy can just stay strong for the entirety of the game's life. But that's all I want to get over, so thanks for watching.